Okay, so this is a yeast bread. This is a Fougasse, which is very similar to a pretzel. It's a lovely tearing bread, and we're going to glaze this with brown sugar, egg yolk, and fennel seed. So my preference actually would be fresh yeast, but we've got dried yeast here, which is easily available. 1% of yeast for the flour. This is a 250 gram strong flour recipe, so 2.5 grams of dried yeast. The flour is important. It's strong flour because it's got extra gluten, extra protein in the flour, which gives the bread the elasticity and the texture. So sieve that together, distributing the yeast into a large bowl. We're just going to use some sea salt here. Just grind it up so you don't have lumps of yeast. Large lumps of yeast actually can affect, large lumps of salt can affect the way in which the yeast works. So it's important just to grind it up. And then the amount of water is really important. So 175 grams of tepid water. The best way to achieve this is to weigh it on some scales. So use some hot water mixed with cold water. And the warmth of the water is going to help the yeast to prove and grow. Straight into there. Mix it together thoroughly. As soon as it clogs up, you can put your hand in here. And what's really important with bread is that you really develop the gluten in the flour, otherwise known as kneading. So it's quite a small loaf, so you can do this pretty much with a single hand. A little bit of flour down if you need to. At this stage, it's quite sticky, and you want to knead this until it becomes more tacky than sticky. Okay, so using as little flour as possible, but just enough so it doesn't stick to the table. So the technique here is really just pushing away, slightly tearing, and then bringing it back on itself. If you find you've got dough stuck to your hands, just rub it off. It's much easier to have a clean table and have clean hands. So just remove that. So the kneading process, not only are you developing the elasticity, but you're also distributing the ingredients and producing a nice even texture. You can really feel the change actually as the flour absorbs the liquid. The dough tightens up and it becomes much more springy. And then you can be sure that you've got the correct texture of the bread. Okay, so it should be springy to touch. This goes into a bowl. Cover with cling film to maintain the heat of the bread, and then prove it until it's doubled in size. So a small loaf like this, you can knead it pretty quickly. My top tip actually for this, as soon as you can see almost like an orange peel effect to the bread, that's a sign that the gluten has just started to fray. So it's at its maximum tightness, and that's when you know that the bread is ready for proving. So you can see on this one, just got that slight orange peel effect on the top. So into a bowl, cover it over. So covering will prevent it from crusting, which will stop it from rising. and also, as I say, maintain the heat in there so it proves quickly. So the Fougasse has proved. You can tell by the activity on the base, lots of little bubbles and some rise. Take off the cling film. That's protected the top of the dough from forming a crust during the proving. And we're going to turn it out onto a clean surface. You'll find at this stage it's a lot less sticky and it's sort of more tacky. Try not to use too much flour if you can help it. If anything, just flour your hands. That's the best practice at this stage. And then we're going to roll this just so that we can cut 3 even-sized pieces. So with these large circles, just to shape them into buns. You can see that action just shapes it into a nice neat bun. So large circle, lots of pressure down on the table. And then starting with the first one, this time you will need some flour and plenty of it. You can just tease these out a little bit and we're going to roll some discs. So we're making fairly small Fougasse. You'll find through the process of shaping these buns that it gets quite elastic again, so there's no harm in just rolling them, letting them rest, and then going back to them. So again, just tease out the dough, just into that disc shape. So just make sure that your disc is relatively thin, something like 12 centimeters in diameter. Sharp knife, cut it in half, and then represents a leaf shape. Use a sharp knife just to create some slashes that go all the way through, like this. And then flour your fingers and just make sure that the slashes open out. So on the tray, just pull them apart because they'll have a tendency to prove back together. Okay, and then repeat with the remaining bread. So at this stage, you want to cover this with cling film and then let it prove again so they're slightly puffy. So the Fougasse has been proving and it's got some nice little bubbled raised parts. It's had the cling film on, so it hasn't formed a crust. And you can see you've got these irregular kind of leaf shapes. So with the glaze, we've got brown sugar and salt going into an egg yolk. So just work this through. This is going to give us a lovely, shiny, slightly sweet glaze. And then we're going to dust it also with some fennel seeds, which have a really unusual flavour. So just really carefully, so as not to knock out any of the air. So using an egg yolk rather than a whole egg just gives you a little bit more colour. The brown sugar gives you some sweetness, a little bit of a shine. And the salt actually just helps to break up the yolk. Just goes a little bit further that way. So nice light brush strokes on here. So you only do this once the bread is fully proofed. It's essentially ready for the oven. So the oven is preheated really, really hot. And we're going to cook these. There's going to be elements of the bread which are quite crispy, and then some areas where it's slightly thicker, where it's going to be slightly soft and slightly doughy. So really, really pleasant to eat this is. Okay, so fennel seeds on the top. They're fairly strong. It's got that sort of aniseed flavour. So just a light scattering, like this, and then into the oven.